Allah Azza wa Jal addresses His beloved Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Qur'an. He says, Allah is the one who has revealed upon you the book. Minhu ayatun muhkamat. From the Qur'an, you have verses that are decisive in their meaning. Hunna ummul kitab. These verses that are decisive in their meaning, they are the foundation of the Qur'an. Wa ukharu mutashabihat. And you have verses that are ambiguous in their meaning. A decisive verse is a verse that does not hold the possibility of any meaning other than its literal meaning. And an ambiguous verse is that verse that holds the possibility of many meanings. Allah says that the decisive verses are the foundation of the Qur'an. Allah says in the Qur'an, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. Nothing resembles Allah. فَلَا تَضْرِبُوا لِلَّهِ الْأَمْثَالِ. Do not establish similitudes for Allah. Do not establish similarities for Allah. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. No one is comparable to Allah. All of these verses decisively mean Allah does not resemble the creation by any regard. Then you have ambiguous verses. Ambiguous verses, and in language generally, you have certain things that are figures of speech. Someone said something, he meant it figuratively. It may have been coined for a certain meaning, but it can be used outside of that meaning. This is a hand. The word hand has been coined for this limb. But if I say, give me a hand while I am picking something up, it doesn't mean give me your hand. It figuratively means help me out. Someone says, I got your back. All languages have figurative speech. I got your back. It means I'm going to defend you. That person passed away, he kicked the bucket. It doesn't literally mean he kicked the bucket. It means that that person has died. He's passed away. These are words that were coined for one meaning, but they're being used for something else. Similarly, in the Qur'an, you have certain verses that are meant figuratively. They're not meant in their literal meaning. If a person says, this verse may mean possibly, it holds the possibility of a variety of meanings. How do you select one meaning versus another? There are two ways to approach ambiguous verses. Either you do tafweed, which means you entrust the meaning to Allah. You say, this verse I affirm, I have conviction in it, but what its precise meaning is, I leave it to Allah. I entrust it to Allah. I'm not going to engage in an interpretive act when it comes to this. On the other hand, you can interpret that verse as well. From the different meanings that that verse may possibly hold, how do you select one over the other? Sometimes if you choose the literal meaning, it's going to clash with decisive verses of the Qur'an. People sometimes conflate literal interpretation with leaving the meaning to Allah. A literal interpretation is still an interpretation. It's an interpretive act. From the many possible meanings that it holds, you're choosing one over the other. That's an interpretive act. You're still doing ta'wil. You're still doing interpretation. Allah says in the Qur'an, 𝗟𝗲𝘀𝗻 وَعَلَى الْعَرْشِ اسْتَوَى. Allah, the Merciful One, has done istiwa upon this great creation of the arsh. Istiwa means, it may mean to have control over something, to hold power over something, to subjugate. It may also mean to sit. Sitting is a physical act. Sitting means this thing is composed, or this person, when he sits, it entails necessarily, he's composed of parts, and then he's hunkering down into something. That's a physical act. Now the word istiwa may mean to control, to subjugate, to have power over, or it may mean to sit. If you're going to interpret this, you cannot interpret it in a way that clashes with the decisive verse of the Qur'an. To sit is a physical act. Allah says He does not resemble the creation. No one is comparable to Allah. You cannot attribute physical attributes to Allah. You cannot attribute creation attributes to Allah. So amongst its appropriate possible meanings is that Allah has control over the arsh. Allah says in another verse of the Qur'an, 𝗟𝗶𝘁𝗀𝗶 Allah has control over His creation. This verse, when you interpret it to mean control, it's harmonious with the decisive verses of the Qur'an. If you interpret it literally like some fundamentalists, some literalists do, you're going to end up clashing with the decisive verse of the Qur'an. The decisive verses, Allah says, are the foundation of the Qur'an. Ambiguous verses in their literal meanings, if they clash, they cannot override decisive verses of the Qur'an. You're going to have to interpret it in a manner that's harmonious, that does not clash with decisive verses of the Qur'an. For fundamentalists who interpret verses literally, they don't realize as they're adamant to interpret it literally, they may end up having an understanding of Allah that is closer to Greek mythology than it is closer to Islam, closer to even Christianity than it is closer to Islam. Because if you interpret everything literally, you may slip into anthropomorphism, to attribute human-like attributes to Allah, to understand Allah physically, to understand Allah through human-like attributes. Allah says, Subhanallah amma yasifun. Glorified is Allah from what they wrongfully attribute to Him. May Allah Azza wa Jal guide us all for the sake of His beloved Habib sallallahu alaihi wasallam.